Hey, what's up, everybody? This is your host,
Nico.
and Irvin, and this is Shining Spotlight, the stream where we highlight creatives in the industry in order to inspire you guys. Today, we have a researcher who's dedicated much careful time to the medium many of us enjoy called manga. He has spent much careful time and energy to highlight the origins of manga even before the time of Osamu Tezuka. This can be found in his book, Comics and the Origins of Manga, a Revisionist History. Which earned him an Eisner, which is one of the highest awards and honors that you can get, among writers, artists, and creatives in the comic industry. Today, we welcome Eike Exner to the show. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming on, Mr. Exner.
I'm really curious, and you've talked about this a little bit in the book. But just for the audience, just briefly, can you talk about what inspired you to want to go back further, in the history of manga, especially, given the day, everybody just thinks of either Osamu Tezuka, or if you're really surface level with manga, people may only think of the stuff like Dragon Ball or whatever. So can you just kind of tell us what inspired you to want to do this research?
So I've always been interested in comics and American comics, European comics, Japanese comics, but my academic training was mostly in comparative literature. And I was planning on writing my dissertation in translation studies. And so I was interested in the translation of stuff that's not entirely textual. So stuff like movies, opera, plays, video games, and comics. And then I read in Frederick Schott's book, Manga, that as early as the 1920s, there were these American comic strips translated into Japanese. And I thought that was really fascinating, that 100 years ago, Japanese people were reading American comics in translation. And so I decided to make that one chapter of my dissertation, essentially. And I got some funding from a university to go to Japan to look at translations of these comic strips, to look for more of them, and to see to what extent they were translated, any other information I could find out. And then I was just blown away by the sheer quantity of material that there was at the time, like in the 1920s, American comic strips and some other foreign comic strips, and also how much closer those comic strips look to modern day manga than a lot of sort of visual material that was published by Japanese authors at the time. So that's really what got me into that subject. And then I realized that this is probably how comics were established in Japan through these translations. That's what it looked like to me. And then I realized that this would actually be a topic for a whole dissertation. And so that's when I decided to focus only on sort of the history of comics and manga.
Okay. That's pretty clear and concise right there. I mean, honestly, every time I've ever thought about it, when it comes to, just the medium, everyone just tells you Osamu Tezuka, that's it. They get right there. They don't bring up things like, I don't want to get too thick, because obviously there's a lot of material in the book, but I will say bringing up father is one of the things that you brought up in the book, which for a lot of people who don't know anything about bringing up father, because I'm pretty sure most of us out there don't, unless you probably read the book, that was a European comic actually that ended up coming over, and it was into Japan. It was translated.
It was American. Bringing Up Father was American.
Yes.
But it was popular not just in Japan but around the world. It's probably one of the most influential works in comics history, which has mostly been forgotten. But the strip was also popular in, I think, Argentina, and in China it was big at the time, and a bunch of other countries. There's the head of King Features, which was the Hearst syndicate that syndicated all these comic strips internationally, in his autobiography says that the strip was published in 600 different cities around the world, and that was their most successful strip internationally. So there's a bunch of countries around the world where Bring Up Father was actually hugely successful, but probably the most successful was in Japan.
Wow. Okay. I mean, just to kind of get a little more into the book and that part of it, you also mentioned key figures that kind of kickstarted a lot of what manga was, as far as how we relate it to as far as what's popular today as a humorous kind of entertaining visual media of sorts. You mentioned one of the key individuals being a gentleman named Kitazawa, I believe.
Yeah.
So expand more on that.
So I think Kitazawa is often portrayed as sort of the grandfather of comics in Japan, but Kitazawa actually was never really interested in comics. So really, quote unquote, Western cartoon, European and American cartoons really come into Japan in the 1890s. And it mostly starts, not exclusively, there are other publications, but it mostly starts in a newspaper called Jiji Shimpo, which translates roughly to like current affairs news. It was one of the first newspapers in Japan that was run on like a commercial basis, financed through advertising revenue rather than being run by a political party or something like that. And so in that newspaper in the 1890s, beginning in 1890, you have all these so-called pantomime cartoons, like multi-panel cartoons that tell sort of a brief story or a brief joke without any text. And so that comes into Japan in the 1890s, and that's actually the first time that the word manga is used with regards to sort of sequential art, like the comics-like storytelling. We have multiple images in sequence, and they tell a story. So the word manga had existed before that, and Hokusai had popularized it, not created it, but popularized the term. But even though in some histories of manga, you see sort of collages of multiple images in Hokusai's work, those are never actual narratives. They're never like a temporal sequence where sort of the same person, there's like this famous image with six guys, and it's often sort of implied that that's a temporal sequence, but it's actually six completely different people. So Hokusai had nothing to do with sort of sequential storytelling. That really only became a thing in the 1890s. And then this word manga that was used for sort of all sorts of drawing, mostly artistic sketches, a lot of naturalistic sketches, like the Hokusai manga. It's a bunch of buildings and like pictures of grass and stuff like that. And then in the 1890s, this guy, Ippo Imaizumi, who was a cartoonist, or one of the first like modern European and American influenced cartoonists at that newspaper, the Jiji Shimpo, starts using this word manga for sequential cartoons. So that's really when the history of manga as sequential storytelling really starts. And then that guy had a degenerative disease, unspecified, but because of that disease, it may have been ALS or something similar to that. He couldn't write or draw anymore. So they had to find a replacement for him. And that replacement was Raken Kitazawa. So Raken Kitazawa was also trained in European and American cartooning. He learned from an Australian cartoonist who later worked for the American cartoon magazine Puck. And then Kitazawa replaced Imaizumi at the Jiji Shimpo in 1899, starts a supplement so that he has like a manga page, essentially like a section. It's like half a page or entire page. And then in 1902, he draws individual cartoons. In 1902, he gets an entire page or half a page. And that page is called Jiji Manga. And it's called Jiji Manga because the newspaper is called Jiji Shimpo. And so he takes over the description, the word manga for these cartoons from Imaizumi, his predecessor. And so it's through that newspaper, the Jiji Shimpo, that this word manga comes to describe cartoons. Because before that, there was a completely different word, ponchi, derived from the British punch or the Japan punch, which was...
Japan punch, yep.
Yeah. So up to that point, the word ponchi is actually much more common in use for cartoons than the word manga. And so it's through Kitazawa's work over like 20 years in the Jiji Shimpo that manga really becomes, and he was very active. Like he actually wrote to another newspaper that had a cartoon feature that they called ponchi, and he wrote them a letter saying, please change this to manga, because he considered the word ponchi to be outmoded and sort of associated with older traditions, whereas he really wanted Japan to catch up to other countries. Because remember, at the time, Japan was industrializing and modernizing. So facing the choice, Japanese people were looking at what was happening with China, which was becoming sort of a de facto European colony. So they were like, well, we have two choices. Either we can become a Western colony like China, or we can try to become a Western like colonial empire ourselves by importing all this Western culture, these European and American technologies and culture. And that was the background of the times. So that was what was going on in Japan at the time. And Kitazawa thought that ponchi sort of was too old. This was like the stuff that people like him, Japanese nationalists at the time, were trying to leave behind. They were trying to make Japan more modern. And Kitazawa, for some reason, thought that the word manga was a more modern, or described more modern cartooning. But ironically, it's only because of Kitazawa that the word manga then becomes associated with sort of contemporary, at the time, contemporaneous European and American cartoons. But Kitazama actually did, even though, so I had to go back even further. Around 1900 is when sort of what most people would now call comics, right? Where you have characters across multiple images having conversations using speech balloons.
Yeah, like audiovisual.
So there are a lot of comic scholars who have very firm notions on what is comics and what isn't comics. And so if you talk to someone like Scott McCloud, right, who's like, oh, the Bayeux Tapestry is comics, and like art from Mesoamerica from the 1400s is comics. So in order to avoid sort of an instinctive like defensive reaction when people read the book, it's like, oh, this guy has like a too narrow conception of comics. They came out with some audiovisual comics so that I could avoid that whole conflict.
I was gonna ask you about that too. Like, not to cut you off, but
please do cut me off, otherwise I'll just rant forever.
Oh no, I want to hear more about it. But like, when it comes to the whole like audio visual media, I was gonna ask you, like, do you think that comics are just like kind of condensed to just being an audio visual media, or do you think that if, let's say, for example, you have just a series of images, but it's telling a story, is that still considered a comic if it's not really displaying any sound?
That's a really great question, because that's exactly what I'm trying to do with the definition of audiovisual comics is not to say like, oh, this is comics, this is not comics, but rather looking at historically, right? Looking at what comics are today, and like over 90% of comics are like multiple images and people talking with speech balloons, right? And have like motion lines and stuff like that. So you have experimental comics, right? And you can have a comic where there's not even any people, right? Where you just see like some building decay over time. Like Art Crumb did something like that, where it just shows like multiple pictures of the same American city over decades. So I don't want to say like, oh, that's a comic or that's not a comic. But my whole sort of the point of my research was trying to figure out, when did this type of storytelling that most people now call comics, right? That if someone tells you I wrote a comic, what the thing that first comes to your mind, when did that actually start? And so, because that's essentially, right, having a protagonist in a story and seeing that protagonist act out the story over multiple images and having conversations depicted as speech balloons. Right? That's essentially the same all over the world, right? That's the same whether you're looking at a Marvel comic or whether you're looking at like Naruto or something like that. And because it looked like that model was introduced to Japan in the 1920s via these American comic strips, that's what led me to try to figure out when that actually started and how that started. Because a lot of times people will say, oh, that's just a natural thing to depict speech and speech balloons. It's just natural or universal. But if that were true, then it doesn't make sense that we don't see that before the 1900s. And it also doesn't make sense why you can trace the spread of that art form from the US to France, to Japan, to China, to other places around the world. And of course, the first objection then is, oh, but you have speech balloons since the 1600s at least. But you never have actually conversations that continue over multiple panels. So you have like these word balloons in single panel cartoons where a character will say something like, I am the king and I want this. So they're not really having a conversation with other characters in like a story world. They're explaining the cartoon to the reader. So it looks like a speech balloon because it has like a bubble with words in it. But it doesn't actually mean that this character is like talking to other characters and then those characters respond in the next panel. So that is a new thing that just didn't exist before 1899, essentially.
It was more narrative, basically, like kind of just telling you, speaking to the audience.
Yeah, narrative. Well, it was like the opposite of that. So the word balloons actually are almost exclusively found in individual single image cartoons. So like political allegories and stuff like that. Whereas story-based or narrative works that had multiple images, so stuff like the picture stories by Rudolf Töpfer in Switzerland and Wilhelm Busch in Germany, which then swept Europe and the United States as well, and even made it to Japan, not Töpfer, but Busch's work, you actually don't see speech balloons in those. So the word balloon in those earlier cartoons from before the late 1800s was actually not associated with conversations or continuing stories at all. If that makes any sense.
No, I think I follow what you're saying. So
It is a very hard thing to wrap your mind around, but you can actually, if you go to like archive.org, there's like several books that collect like cartoons preceding the late 1800s. There's also cartoon magazines that there's a great website called Hathi Trust, Hathi, and then Trust. And they they make available digitized works from around the world. And you can look at a lot of European and American cartoon magazines actually from the 1800s, like Life and Judge and Puck. And so if you want to look at these cartoons actually and see what I'm talking about for yourself so that you don't have to just rely on whether I'm actually just making something up or not, those are all available online. So you can actually look at a lot of the history of cartooning on the internet. It's just, it's not very widely publicized, but this material is all out there somewhere accessible. But so for the sake of this interview, just take me at my word about this, that like this particular type of comic storytelling, right, where people having conversations using speech balloons, which I'm just using as a shorthand for comics, because I'm not saying that if that doesn't happen, that it's not a comic, or that, right, that it needs to be that way. But this particular thing was created at a particular moment in time for like particular reasons. The reasons namely being like the spread of first like visual technologies like photography and film, and then the speech balloon really came in because of the phonograph and the radio and the telephone, like these first technologies that were actually able to replicate speech. And because that was such a new thing at the time, cartoonists started making jokes about it. But if you want to make a joke about someone hearing a voice, you have to include the voice somehow, right? You have to depict that somehow.
Yeah, I think the example of the comic that you gave, wasn't it where there was like a bird in the what was it? A bird was in the
the parrot shows up a lot.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So there's the famous, I mean, people may have seen the is that visible on screen, the Yellow Kid cartoon. So that's very famous. But that's actually by far not the only cartoon like that. So as early as 1890, you have a similar cartoon about the phonograph, where then also the parrot says something to the phonograph records it, and then the phonograph belongs to some professor who uses it for a lecture, and then the parrot was just cursing, and then the phonograph plays back the curse words. And in these early cartoons about like these like sound jokes, the sort of sound images like speech balloons, but it's not always a balloon. But when you have sound depicted graphically, like inside the image, it's almost always a joke about this type of phenomenon, but recorded sound. Or like the parrot, right? This is also another example where, I don't know if it's visible.
I think we kind of can see it a little bit.
Yeah, so there's this guy has like
it's clear now.
Yeah, like a trunk that he's taking along some kind of travel, and then out of the trunk you hear this voice saying, "Help, help." And then the police come and open the trunk, and it's a parrot saying that. And you can see that like this type of joke was related to the phonograph, right? So the first time in history, you could hear a voice without having the person who said the original line actually be there. So that was like a really freaky experience. Obviously for us, right, we're not immediately in front of one another. Yeah, we're used to it. But if you like did a Zoom conversation with a person 200 years ago, they would freak out. Because it's not something that they would ever have heard, right? Whenever they heard a voice their entire life, the person would have been right there. And so that's why these cartoons at that time
would have been witchcraft or some sort.
Yeah, exactly. It would have been crazy. It would have been magic. And so to people at the time, it really was like this crazy new thing. And that's why we see it in cartoons. And that's then how sound sort of starts being integrated into cartoons. And that happens first in the US because the phonograph was way more common in the US. So like this happens around 1900, and in Japan until like the 1910s, the phonographs were super expensive. So only very rich people could afford it. So most people had never heard of phonographs before, or maybe they'd heard about them, but they'd never experienced one. And there's even an anecdote from the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, 1905, when Japan and Russia fought and Japan won. And there's an anecdote that the retreating Russian soldiers had left behind phonograph records, and then they were captured by Japanese soldiers, and they tried to eat them because they thought they were rice crackers. Now, I don't think that anecdote is actually true because it sounds kind of silly, but whether it's true or not, like the fact that that was a thing that was told at the time, or like in the aftermath, kind of shows that around 1905, the phonograph records were still unknown to most Japanese people, right? This anecdote was believable because it was believable that most Japanese people would not know what a phonograph was. So my theory is that that's why we don't see that storytelling, that kind of comics, like audiovisual comics, take root in Japan at the time. And so to circle back to Kitazawa, so that was a really long tangent, but the whole history doesn't really make sense without knowing that. Because Kitazawa, so these comic strips, mostly the Katzenjammer Kids and Happy Hooligan, those are sort of the first two modern comic strips. And Kitazawa was following developments, and he was very familiar with British cartooning, with French cartooning, and with American cartooning. And so Kitazawa knew of these comic strips, and he, as early as 1902, he actually uses this format, right? It's showing people having conversations across multiple panels using speech balloons. But Kitazawa didn't really care about storytelling. He was mostly all about political and social cartooning. So he always wanted to make some kind of educational or political point with his cartoons. And based on his autobiographical writings, it seems that the only reason why he actually created some stories is that they sold. And the Jiji Shimpo and then also a magazine that Kitazawa started were commercial enterprise, right? So you wanted to sell copies. And if you just make like these political points, there probably wasn't that big a market for it, right? So people wanted to be entertained. So in order to be commercially viable and sell copies, you want to entertain people. And the best way of doing that was to tell stories and to tell jokes, right? That weren't necessarily these heavy-handed political points about how Japan needed to modernize or invade this country or that country. And so even though this format of comics, right, what I call audiovisual comics, basically sequential narratives using speech balloons and motion lines and stuff like that, was known in Japan as early as 1902, but didn't really catch on. And so my explanation that I've arrived at through my research
till bringing up Father.
Exactly, till Bring Up Father. So Bring Up Father, really, you could call it the first modern manga, like the origins or one origin point. You could definitely call it one origin point of modern manga.
You realize that probably scares a lot of like modern, like your average manga fan out there. Like, what? You mean to tell me?
I've learned that it makes a lot of people very upset because there are a lot of people who like manga because it's Japanese. So if you tell them actually it's way less Japanese, it's also not specifically American. So this is like a universal thing, right? It just happened to occur in the United States first because the United States was more technologically advanced at the time. And there was sort of greater permeation in society with these visual technologies like photography and sound recording. So it's coincidence. It's not like a specifically American medium. It just happened to occur in the US first and then spread. And the same thing happens in France, for example, in the 1920s, where newspapers start serializing American comic strips in translation. And then French artists start drawing comic strips using speech balloons. And that doesn't really catch on before that. And so you can really see this happen in, I would assume, I haven't looked at the publication record of every individual country in the world, but every country that you look at the 1920s and 1930s, you see this happen through American comic strips. So there's a I think Belgian, I'm sorry if I'm getting this wrong, I think he's a Belgian scholar in Thailand who just wrote a book about the history of comics in Thailand, and the same thing happened there. So I think it's reasonable to assume that it was a universal thing that really the comics form around the world, the audiovisual comics form really spread via these American comic strips, which started to be internationally syndicated in the late 1910s and early 1920s. So the reason why Bring Up Father came to Japan is that King Features, or rather International Feature Service, those names are often used interchangeably. They were both Hearst, William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper mogul. There were two of his companies, and they had an office in Tokyo. So they actually had a representative there. So it wasn't complete happenstance, right? That these comics came to Japan willy-nilly. There was an American company that was trying to sell them, and there were Japanese editors who had been around the world. And so the editor who decided to license Bring Up Father had actually been reading it on like trips overseas in the US. So he was familiar with the strip. He could read it in English. He thought it was funny. He thought the humor was universal. And so he wanted to license it for his own newspaper. And that's sort of how that whole thing happened. It was a huge success in Japan. And so if you have competition, right, between different newspapers, and one newspaper starts doing something that sells a lot of copies, then if you're an editor of a competing newspaper, you start wanting the same thing, right? Because you want to keep up with the competition. And that's how other newspapers start featuring American comic strips as well. And that's then how the first Japanese comic strips were drawn. So the very first sort of long-lasting Japanese comic strip, Nonki na Tosan, or Easygoing Daddy, or Careless Dad. There's like a bunch of Carefree Dad. There's a bunch of translations out there. But that
Jigs
happened.
and Maggie was the other one, I think, or is it?
No, Jigs and Maggie are the protagonists of Bringing Up Father.
Okay, I thought it was maybe another name that they also.
Oh no, yeah, those were also used interchangeably. Like a lot of people would refer to Bring Up Father as Jigs and Maggie, and it was actually published in at least one Japanese publication under that title, Jigzu to Magi. But so the Easygoing Daddy comic strip drawn by a Japanese artist, that was because his editor literally said, "Oh, this Bring Up Father thing is successful. I want you to draw me something like that for my newspaper." So it's very, like, the historical record is very clear. Like, whether you agree with my hypothesis about whether this is related to sound recording or not, like, even if you think that's complete BS, it's the record that this particular form of storytelling came in through these American comic strips and was adopted because it was popular and successful with Japanese readers. That's actually very clear in the historical record. Like, I had one early peer reviewer of my book said, "Oh, this is denying the agency of Japanese people," but it's not. But it's Japanese editors who picked these strips for Japanese publications, and it's Japanese readers who liked them, and then Japanese artists. So this was like, and it wasn't like the U.S. was forcing this upon Japan. It was like Japanese people who saw this and who liked it, and who adopted it as part of their own culture. And the same thing you see happening with movies, for example, during the time with jazz as well, which was huge in Japan in the 1920s. So this is not like an isolated thing, right? It's related to all these other developments that we see happening
all around the same time.
Yeah, it all happened around the same time. A lot of people think that Japan was this completely shut off country before 1945, when all of a sudden, because of the American occupation, there was, like, Japan watched, like, King Kong in the 1930s. That was a huge. You see, like, newspaper advertisements for all these foreign films. Like, it wasn't just American stuff; it was also European stuff. But Japan, like, especially in the 1920s, then in the 1930s, when the country sort of shifts rightward and becomes fascist eventually, that kind of recedes. But in the 1920s, especially, Japanese cities like Tokyo, where they were completely cosmopolitan, and you could go to cafes and listen to jazz, you could watch, like, the latest Charlie Chaplin movie, you could read comic strips, like that. It was a very international culture.
So really quick, because I have a lot to say about.
Oh yeah, sorry. Feel free to interrupt me before I go.
Oh no! But I just want to make sure we address some of the comments that come through. All right, so the first comment that we had earlier, Eike, which university are you attached to? That's from Jeff Lilly. Oh,
I'm what's called an independent scholar now, which is a euphemism for unemployed. So I now work as a translator because and I wouldn't recommend this to anyone who wants to pursue a career in academia. Don't do comics. Like, there are no comics departments, so you would have to find a job in most common are English literature, or if you do, like, manga, then Japanese literature. But if your whole thing is comparative stuff, so if your whole work is sort of about the international spread of comics, that makes it a lot harder to find a job in a university department, because they're all about regional studies, and there are no comic studies departments. So I am no longer affiliated with any university. I now, like, do this for shits and giggles, essentially, because and it's also not a moneymaker, unfortunately. You don't, unless you write something that's, like, published by a trade publisher that becomes, like, a huge hit. I just really, I'd already done most of the work for my dissertation. I just wanted it out there, and it's hopefully eventually correct stuff like the Wikipedia entry for the history of manga and stuff like that. But yeah, sorry, I started rambling again.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I'm
the short story is I'm no longer affiliated with the university.
All right. Imaginos Pete, this is very informative. Thank you. YouTube user, hello everyone. It's Ira. Hey, what's up, Ira? All right. Imaginos Pete, another excellent guest by Shining Otaku. Mr. Exner's wealth of knowledge is making an entertaining and interesting episode. Gotta take notes.
That's very sweet. Thank you.
Imaginos TV, mad interesting. Let's see here. Get to these comments a little quicker. Imagine contingent is present. Let's see here. Here's another question. Okay, here we go. Jeff Lilly. What are some sources, archives, collections that you've explored while in Japan?
So the most important resource in Japan is the National Diet Library, which is basically the Japanese equivalent of the Library of Congress. They have most publications, the most publications anywhere in Japan. So most things you can look at in the National Diet Library. They have all the major newspapers, for example. So that's like 90% of my research while in Japan was spent at the National Diet Library, just looking through newspaper reels. There are some magazines and some papers that they don't have there. There was one newspaper that featured a couple of American comic strips that was based in Osaka, and so I had to contact that newspaper directly. Unfortunately, they had a really nice archivist who was very helpful. Some publications are not very cooperative, but that person was super nice. And then the Kyoto International Manga Museum has some publications from the 20s and 30s that you can't really find anywhere else in the world. And then like a couple of university libraries here and there, and like the Museum of Newspapers and the Modern Literature Museum in Japan. So that was, and then I did the stuff about like the sort of the origins of comics in the U.S. that I did in the U.S. Unfortunately, that mostly happened in a single newspaper, and then all the cartoon magazines are digitized, so you can do that stuff online. But really, and this is one reason I think why this history hasn't really been uncovered earlier or rediscovered earlier, is that you can't really do it outside of Japan. And you do have to spend a lot of time just pointlessly looking through newspapers, because the comic strips published in newspapers were an index, right? So you can't look them up. You just have to like look through newspapers and just like look through page by page to find them, essentially. I mean, there are people who have done some work and who have, there's a Chinese scholar who wrote her dissertation on Japanese children's manga in like 8 different newspapers. So she had cataloged a lot of manga, both sort of comics and then also picture stories, where it's sort of where the images and text are separate, where you just have like a narrated story that then is illustrated with images. So she had all grouped that under the umbrella term manga. And it's one of the problems with sort of comic studies, right, that different people will use different terms to describe the same thing or different things. And sort of manga has been used as a catch-all. I'm getting way off track again.
Oh no, it's fine. You know what? When you're talking, I feel like we're just like, wow, like it's like a teacher, just So I mean, do your thing, say your thing.
I don't know if I was recently, I like a lot of people, I spent a lot of time on Twitter, and there was recently a great tweet where, I don't know if you saw the video of Joe Biden saying like, oh, they're going to find out, they will find out. And someone tweeted that out saying, when someone accidentally asks about the topic of your dissertation or research, that's sort of usually what that triggers, is me going off on like a 2-hour speech saying they're about to find out. But long story short, so the National Diet Library is probably the single most important place for doing any research on pre-war manga, so pre-1945 manga. Though the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library at The Ohio State University also has a pretty good collection. And they asked me, so I was there for research earlier this year, and they asked me what they could add to like improve their collection. I said, well, you should get the entire run of the Jishimpo, because that's sort of where the origins of manga really started, and like how the term was used, and like the importation of cartoons. And then I looked it up, and I was like, oh, actually, this would cost you like tens of thousands of dollars, because these they're either available on microfilm reels or as book volumes, and it's just tens of thousands of dollars. But they actually got it approved, so now they actually do have. They're the only place in the U.S. where you can actually look through that entire run. So if you're in the U.S. and interested in doing research on this, on like the beginnings of manga, starting from the 1890s, then you can do that in Ohio now as well. But unfortunately, to really get a whole picture, you would probably have to be in Tokyo.
Interesting. Okay, so we're going to get to the other questions in a moment, but before we do, of course, there's a couple things that we have to say first. If you are new to Shining Otaku, this is the first time you come check out, the Shining Spotlight segment where we interview creators in the industry. make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, hit that bell so that you actually get a notification so you know when we do an episode. And then also, I want to also say that we have the Honeycomb Hideout that we recommend that you guys check out, which is our show basically by Joe and Christine, over at the Honeycomb Hideout, where we talk about pop culture. We talk about everything you name it in terms of any controversial topics in the industry. It's kind of like how would you say, Nico, like Howard Stern for geeks, but except a little bit different. It's kind of changed over time, but you can find it on Spotify, and there's going to be a link down below for you guys to check that out. All right, let's get back to everything now.
All right. So really, when you got into it, like one of the things that really stood out is the fact that when we try to get to the direct origins of manga, and depending on how you really look at it, I mean, this whole thing deviates into so many different spectrums. I mean, it's crossed over by Shumpyo, Ponchi. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. Tobai. But as far as modernized and recognized today, the best possible direction as far as its origin is how Kitazawa and of course the few individuals that were key around his time period, they pretty much what made it renowned and recognized as it stands today with the word balloons and how the sound formats work on these pages. I'm not sure if I'm using this word correctly. The transdiegetic.
Yeah.
Transdiegetic comic strips, or comic, as you would. So I was actually kind of curious about the individuals after Kitazawa, because it seemed like after him there was another gentleman named Okamoto, I believe his name.
Yeah, they were contemporaries.
Right. And it was that gentleman, if I understand correctly, who actually implemented the speech bubbles.
No.
Oh, okay.
But that's actually an excellent question. So to your first point about sort of what manga really is, right? You brought up Tobae. So the historiography of manga and comics has been made more difficult by the fact that most scholars don't use clearly defined terms. And like the word manga has had such different meanings in history. So, and you have to remember that this is in the 1920s. People had no idea that comics would become such a huge industry. So at the time, people just grouped everything together. So everything that was like cartoons was just the same thing, whether it be like a single panel cartoon or like a caricature or like a longer story. And so what I was trying to do with my research is find out where this longer storytelling comes from, right? So you have sort of manga is this thing, and in a lot of histories of manga sort of all mixed together, that people say like, oh, manga was this and then it became this, but that's not really true. So manga it wasn't that there was these single panel cartoons in the early 1900s that were called manga and they like morphed into something else. And that's my issue with a lot of historiography of manga, that it sort of pretends like, oh, there were picture scrolls in sort of the 1200s and they morphed into something else and then morphed into something else, and then all of a sudden you have Dragon Ball. Right. So that's just simply not what happened. So what I wanted to find out was, where did Dragon Ball come from? So it's obvious because there are no intermediaries, right? So you cannot trace Dragon Ball back to sort of the Hokusai manga or stuff like that. So my question was like, where did stuff like Dragon Ball come from, and why does it look so similar to comics all around the world? And so in order to do that, that's why I came up with the term audiovisual comics, sort of try to narrow down the subject, so that when I say manga, or like the type of manga that I'm interested in is audiovisual comics, right? So these longer stories. So I'm not interested in political cartoons, right? Like single panel cartoons. That is also interesting in its own right, but it doesn't help us understand where the stuff that now is sold in like Barnes and Nobles all around the US comes from, because that did not evolve out of these single panel cartoons. And then your second point about transdiegetic. So that's I know it's not a great word. I couldn't really come up with anything better. When I was looking into the origins of speech balloons, I realized that they evolved in fairly close proximity to other stuff like motion lines and especially pain stars or impact stars. So in early cartoons and even the 1950s still, you see this, I mean, beyond that. In Tezuka Osamu's cartoons, like the character gets hit in the head, there are all these stars everywhere. So that comes, and I've actually managed to track down what I think is the precise point when that happened. That was introduced to Japan in the 1890s, 1894 to be precise, also through American cartoons. So these like stars, and I was really fascinated that no one had ever bothered to look into that, because I'd always thought that was really weird that you see that like before 1900, you see this in the US and Japan. I was like, where did this come from? Because it's not like a natural thing, right? You're not like, oh, this person's in pain. Clearly there should be stars in the air. Like in English, there's the expression like to see stars, right? But like that doesn't exist in Japanese. So there's no like reason why this should have existed independently. But so that also comes into Japan in the 1890s. So all these different forms of representing something that you couldn't otherwise see, right? So if you have a single image, you wouldn't be able to see motion in it. You wouldn't be able to see the sound. You wouldn't be able to see any pain. Right. And it's not limited to that. You also have like these like freestanding question marks, exclamation points to show confusion, right? You have like dollar signs for greed, right? You have like the heart shape to indicate love. So all of this stuff functions in the same way. It like makes something visible for the reader that the reader otherwise wouldn't be able to see, right? You can't see directly that someone's in love, that someone's greedy, that someone is in pain, that someone is saying something. I mean, you could show them with their mouth open, but you wouldn't be able to know what sound they're making. So all of that started developing in the late 1800s, and then new forms get added around 1900 and beyond that. And there wasn't a good word. There's like the word emanata, but it's usually more refers to something like anything like emanating from a character. So it didn't really capture speech balloons. So I was looking for something to frame all of that as like the same category, because I really think that it is essentially the same thing. This is like a new thing that happens in the late 19th century in cartooning and then spreads around the world. And I think this is what enabled modern comics. It's not just word balloons, it's like speech, right? It's like sound and it's motion and it's all these other things that help you show a story instead of having to explain it underneath, right? Like this character is in love with this character is confused. You can just show it by including these symbols. And so that's why I group as transdiegetic, diegetic being like the story world and trans being like across. So it's like transport, like basically translating it from the story world into our world. So like in film studies, especially, there's stuff like intradiegetic, inside the story world. So if in my book, I use the example, like the Jaws theme, right? In Jaws, like the shark can't hear that. Like no one in the movie's like, oh, I hear the Jaws theme, there's a shark around, right? It's only the viewer that knows, oh, the shark is around. But like if you hear a character play music in a movie, then you're like, oh, that's the character obviously hears the music that they're playing. So there's that distinction. And like the way that stuff like the speech balloon works, it's both at the same time, right? Like the sound is intradiegetic. It's inside the story. The characters can hear it, but they can't see the speech balloon, like the actual balloon with the words written. Like only we can see that. So that's why I came out with that word transdiegetic, which is not, it's probably not going to catch on because it's not like a very catchy term, but it was the only way really that I found of explaining how this stuff works, and also that it works in the same way, that actually the speech balloon and motion lines and paint stars, they're actually not three distinct things. They're all part of the same development in cartooning, like in the late 1800s and like around 1900, where like cartoonists start realizing, oh, we can actually represent all these things. It's not like if you look at like post-Renaissance Western art, if you see like something in the air or falling, there's no motion lines. Like because people thought, and this is like, now we get like super abstract. I'm trying not to like go too wild and like theoretical.
Okay.
But people thought that vision was like a representation of truth, right? And like there is no lines when something's falling, right? So people and if you, I mean, you can clearly see this if you look at any European art between, oh, what's happening? Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can still hear you. I mean, we spoke you for a bit there, but yeah, you're good.
So in European and sort of European influenced art, whatever you see has to actually be there. So it was like a new realization. And you see that in art, is like in painting as well, with Impressionism and Cubism, that artists were like, wait a minute, we can actually do more interesting things. We don't have to depict everything as it is. We can sort of show like things in different ways and like show more than you can see, right? So Cubism is like, oh, we'll show you the same thing from different angles all at the same time. We don't have to be realistic. And so I don't think it's a coincidence, and there's people who've written about this, that at the same time that we see stuff like Cubism and Impressionism evolve, that we also see in cartooning, cartoonists having the same realization, right? We can actually show more than what's real. So we can actually show sound, right? In Cubism, you show a completely different side at the same time. And in cartooning, you're like, oh, we can actually show sound. Like, we don't have to do what's realistic. We can actually do more than that. And so that's, to get back to your question about transdiegetic, that's sort of what I've been trying to capture with that term. And if anyone has a better term, I will gladly use it.
So really quick, you know, I want to ask this. So in the community that we're in, you know, which is considered to be like the original English language manga community, which is kind of like people, I don't know if you've ever heard of it before, but one of the things that I think, you know, you have some creators do and some other creators don't do is there's like the whole thing of right to left. Like, should you do it right to left, left to right? I thought it was really interesting, and you kind of highlighted this in the book, you know, where, you know, originally when, you know, you had a lot of, you know, I'm going to say, you know, what was, you know, manga then, you know, or, you know, like a lot of the comics then, when they would bring them over, they would still, even though they translate them, keep them in left to right, rather than having them be like, oh, we're going to do right to left. And I saw a parallel with that. So I don't know, like, I don't know, like, do you think that that's like, what reason, like what larger reason do you think that they did that? Like, was there no reason that they could just, you know, switch them over? Or, you know, I guess I just kind of want to know if you can expand on that a little bit.
That's a really good question. So, and there is a really interesting parallel, right? Where in the beginning, it was like, well, there were some attempts. So the first translations of Bring Up Father, the first couple of episodes, they actually were trying to make it more Japanese. They kept the first episode has like the panels in the American order, like going left to right, but then the writing is going the other way, which is then confusing, right? Because you have to like go one way and then you have to jump. And of course, that's exactly what happened with the first translations of manga in like the 1980s, when people are like, oh, how are we going to do this? And flipping now, because you already had like more advanced editing technology, especially with digital technology, it's a lot easier to like flip images, right? And like rearrange them. But that was pretty difficult at the time. And so eventually what most publications in the 1920s did is they were just like, screw it, we're just going to use the original reading order. It's the easiest thing. And it's really only then in the 1930s that like the more traditional Japanese reading order of reading vertically and from right to left becomes more common. I don't know if it was necessarily for authenticity's sake. I do know that because so many of these comic strips, like Bring Up Father, was a specifically labeled an American manga. It was called a Beikoku manga. And then Little Jimmy was called a Gaikoku manga, a foreign manga. So the foreignness, like, kind of seems to have had something to do with the appeal, similar to how like the Japaneseness of manga has something to do with their appeal. And I think that's a factor in sort of the right. Like, a lot of people are upset if you actually flip a manga now, because they're like, I want to read this as close to the original as possible. But I do think that was one of the most interesting discoveries for me, that actually, like, it wasn't only Bring Up Father or Noki Natousen. There were actually like a dozen or more Japanese manga, like written and drawn by Japanese people, that actually use like left to right reading orders, which is funny because now obviously, like, when you like Google what are the differences between manga and comics, people are like, oh, well, manga is read right to left, whereas that has not always been true historically. And then to your question about original English language manga, I think that's super fascinating because it again shows like the different meanings that the word manga has, right? When you say manga to a lot of people, it means something that's written in a Japanese style. Like, it's manga because, like, with the success of Tezuka Osamu's work in the 1950s, Tezuka, who was strongly influenced by Disney, and also Bring Up Father, by the way, he read Bring Up Father as a child. But Tezuka was very influenced by Disney and like Fleischer Studios animation, like Betty Boop and stuff like that. And so his very early works look very American. And then in like the early 1950s, he starts, and this is probably influenced by like illustrations of women that were popular in the 1920s and 1930s. He starts drawing the noses like straight, as opposed to drawing like round shapes and stuff like that. And he was using like horizontal, like Mickey Mouse type eyes, like very large, like sorry, not horizontal, vertical, large eyes, as he was familiar with from like Disney stuff. And then he just turns them horizontal. And so his very early women characters often have like sort of a straight and then sort of like a kind of the precursor to the nose that you know from like virtually all manga and anime characters now. But sort of you see that start with Tezuka, and then at some point, especially with Princess Knight, when he has to come up with an androgynous character, right, that can pass for both man and woman at the same time. That's then kind of when he starts applying the style also to his male characters. And you can clearly see how then, because of the success of Tezuka's work and the popularity of it, most Japanese mangaka start emulating that and start using this drawing style. And this is really when in the 50s and then over the course of the 60s and 70s, that really becomes the mainstream manga style. And you can see with artists like Tsuyoshi Haru, for example, or Shirato Sanpei, like that in the beginning, a lot of them actually used the Tezuka style, but then when they were sort of explicitly trying to create a different type of manga, right, something that's more serious, more adult, with less of the slapstick that Tezuka still had in his comics, that's when they start drawing a noticeably different style. So like a lot of like Shirato stuff, in the beginning, like his chins were also pointy, like Tezuka stuff, right, with the same nose, like the big eyes. And then for when he starts doing like his like Hashihon and like Gekiga stuff, where he's like explicit, like I want to make something serious, right, like in a samurai epic that's like serious and dark. That's when he starts like making the eyes smaller, making the chins like angular. That's a really fascinating development. But of course now like this like Tezuka influenced style has become so ubiquitous and so synonymous with manga. That's really what the word manga to a lot of people has come to mean, right? When you say like manga, I know from a librarian and curator at OSU who has shown her students like manga from like the 1930s or 1940s, and students were like, "That's not manga," but it's like it's comics from Japan, like drawn by Japanese like mangaka.
So I wonder if people would maybe think that a comic like what is it? Easygoing Daddy, would be more akin to manga, because that was like wasn't that really like the real first shot at like someone being like, okay, let's actually try to do this ourselves outside of just translating it.
Yeah, it was definitely the first Japanese drawn manga in the sense of a comic, right? Like a comic strip, like a narrative strip, an audiovisual narrative strip. Oh, back to your question about Okamoto, actually. So Okamoto was similar to Kitazawa in the fact that the two of them were like the biggest names in manga, but Kitazawa was more interested in political and social cartoons, and Okamoto was more interested in picture stories. So Okamoto also knew about American comics at the time, like audiovisual comics, but he really liked Wilhelm Busch. I mean, I don't know, I'm from Germany, so Wilhelm Busch is like something that you grew up with in Germany. It's these picture stories where basically you have a written story and then it's like illustrated with images. So and Okamoto he loved that, and he like literally told other cartoonists at the time that they should write picture stories like that. Like he was a huge fan of Bush's work. So Okamoto was he also just didn't like comics. So Kitazawa and Okamoto were the two biggest names until the early 1920s. And then when Bring Up Father comes in and is so successful, and then with Nonki Nato-san and like all these early Japanese comics, that's when Kitazawa and Okamoto rapidly lose in significance. And eventually both of them actually start drawing comics probably in response to that, because they're afraid of becoming irrelevant. But you see their influence wane when people like Yutaka Aso, the creator of Nonki Nato-san, and other early comic strip artists then become super successful in Japan.
Nice. So, we're at the point now in the interview where we're about to wrap up really soon. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to do a little bit of a rapid round with these questions here that we have here. And then of course we'll get to some of our last few or our big question that we ask, our traditional question that everyone out there knows. So let's get to that right here. What's the first thing we have? Okay, Imaginos Pete. What kind of socio-cultural obstacles do you think American manga creators may encounter in the Japanese market or with a Japanese audience, if any?
That is a really good question. And it goes back to when you say American manga creators, right? The first time I heard that question before at a symposium about OEL, right? Original English language manga. And I was like, what do you mean? Originally, that's just a comic. Because I don't, right? So, and I think that boils down to the difference in drawing styles, right? I think when you say American manga creators, it's like a comics artist essentially who draws in a Tezuka Osamu influenced style, right? I think that's an accurate way probably of characterizing that. I think in general, I mean, even for Japanese mangaka, it's incredibly hard to break into the comics market in Japan. And for foreigners, I mean, essentially, unless you're a native Japanese speaker, you'd have to have your stuff translated. And one reason, for example, why we see American comics gradually disappear from Japan in the 1930s, I mean, with exceptions like Bring Up Father, is that it's just much more of a hassle for publishers to translate stuff, right, and to import stuff. Why would like Shonen Jump feature like a story written by an American that they have to translate into Japanese first, right? And then maybe there's like some like cultural things that they have to like edit. I mean, even if that's not the case, that's certainly what they're thinking. They're like, why bother, right? We can sell stuff with the stuff that we get from Japan. Why should we bother? So I think I'm not super with the caveat. I'm not super familiar with the in and outs of comics publishing today, whether it be in Japan or the US. But I think there are probably huge obstacles. I don't know if they're necessarily sociocultural, but I think the thing, you would have to do something that's different, right? That makes the additional effort on the parts of a publisher worth it. So I know there's a Czech comics artist actually who's currently trying to get his work translated into Japanese and published in Japan. Who's doing crowdfunding for that, and like I think it's incredibly hard to do that, but the way to do it is probably not to try to imitate what's popular in Japan. You'd have to do something that's different from what's currently popular, where a Japanese publisher would be like, oh, this is something that's currently not out there that we can only get from abroad, only from you, from this one person. That would make it worth it to them. But I mean, I have no idea what that would be, right? Like no one knows. That's why things become popular, because no one, I mean, if you could predict what would be popular, what would be successful, like everybody would be doing it, right?
Exactly, for sure. You know, you think about there's certain things that, you know, I mean, right now, I mean, and I'm kind of curious on your take on this. It seems like you have a lot of Japanese comics that are kind of parodying the superhero genre, like My Hero Academia, One Punch Man. I don't know, you know, kind of, you know, what your opinion is on that, but I noticed that, you know, that's becoming kind of a thing, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's partly due to the fact that even though American comics themselves aren't doing great in Japan, like you do have the Marvel movies, right? So most Japanese people are familiar with these characters primarily through the Marvel movies now. Like they know of them, but there are very few Japanese people who actually read American comics, especially superhero comics.
Okay, and I'm going to read these two more comments, and then we will go ahead and I'll let you take over, Nico. All right, Jeff Lilly. My friend is an archivist for a university in Vermont. He curates a huge comic collection in his university library and teaches comics history. Michigan State University has a comics curriculum in addition. So there are a few comics jobs in academia, not many, but a few. I think that was in response to what you were saying.
Yeah, and that's certainly true. And yeah, Michigan State University also has a great comics collection. I don't know about their manga collection, but they do have a very extensive American comics collection.
Okay, Nico, take us away.
Good. All right. So, in your line of work, obviously you ended up deviating from this.
I like the bozo comment.
Let's see.
The person wrote that, I think you should look into it. I think you'll actually find that.
So this is from Twitch. Let's see here. Well, I'll read it. This guy is a bozo. Comics don't have audio. They're made of paper. Shaking my head. Okay.
The thing that I always say in response to comments like that is that there's no, like, what's the alternative theory, right? So if it's not, and I mean, you do see like the representations directly of like the phonograph in the first cartoons that have sort of depictions of sound. But then even if you don't believe that, like, what's the alternative theory? Why did it take, if this is just a thing that anyone could have created anywhere in the world at any point in history with just paper and a pencil, why don't we see it before like 1899, 1900? And why does it like come through translations of American comics? Like if anyone could ever, if it's just a universal thing, why doesn't it happen in multiple places and at like any time in history? Why is it specifically, and I mean, you even see the precursor with like silent cartoons that like tracks like audiovisual technology, well, like visual technologies, like zoetropes, like early forms of animation. Like you really see like these close historical connections. And like, what's the alternative theory? What's a better, like, give me, I'm open to a better explanation. Just tell me, like, what's your explanation why we don't see stuff like Dragon Ball or like any like modern comic in like the 1400s in like Italy?
You know, I like that because it's almost like, hey, Daniel, you got a challenge, you know, like, you know, like the challenge has been opened.
Like I've spent so many years. I mean, I find this so much. I mean, now I find it mostly amusing. At the beginning, I was frustrated when people would say stuff like that because I spent so many years researching this. And there's like random people on the internet who'll be like, "Oh, that's nonsense. I know better." And it's like, well, do the research. Like, show me. I would love to see that. Prove me wrong. I'll be happy to admit that I'm wrong. But like, do the actual research.
Okay. All right, Nico. You know, you know, it's crazy. Like when it comes to comments like that, though, like, I mean, honestly, like what I find, and I have to say this just for the audience to know this, like, if you look at this book, there's so many sources. Like you put a lot of, like you showed all your sources in there. So if you do want to challenge,
it has a lot of pictures too. Like I wish I could have included more pictures, unfortunately, because there's always a trade-off with price. I think it's overpriced. I don't make much money of this. I wish it were like 50% cheaper. But if they had included more pictures, it would make it more expensive. So that's the reason why
I think it's worth it, to be honest with you.
I think I got like 60 pictures, but I did make sure, especially the thing about sound, like I kind of almost wasted a lot of pictures on like my point about sound that could have been used in like showcasing more translated American comics. But I included like so many of these like cartoons where you can actually see like directly like the speech balloon, right? It's only the phonograph that has a speech balloon in this one and stuff like that, precisely because I expected, or like you have like all these like jokes that are precisely like about sound, and only the sound that's like important for the joke is actually represented, and you see people talking, it's not represented. So I like included so many pictures just to make sure that, like, because I knew this was going to be the most controversial point, but it's like essential to the explanation for why it was Bring a Father that introduced comics to Japan, right? Or why no Japanese person did this before. So in order for the history to make sense, I had to explain like this point about sound. But it is documented with a lot of pictures, and that's also why it's on the cover, the phonograph.
There you have it. And with that being said, rolling into some of our final couple of questions here. Now you disassociated yourself from the universities background that you came from in order to go international with your research and studies here. Would you consider anyone even in the ball running as far as competing with you in this regard? You know, anybody who would be considered your rival of sorts is how we term it.
There are people in Japan who do the same research. I mean, there's two people who are credited in the acknowledgements who've helped me a lot. there is outside of Japan. I mean, one of the, like I said, you can't really do this research outside of Japan. I was lucky that my advisor found me a job at a university in Japan where I could actually do this research while teaching there. And it's just not, because few people are interested in this stuff, right? Like the students at OSU who said, oh, that's not really manga. Like, it's just not, most people who are into manga are into more modern stuff. Most people who are into comics, like American comics, are more into modern stuff. So it's not like a super popular subject. So outside of Japan, I'm probably I don't like saying this, but I'm probably the most knowledgeable person outside of Japan on the subject. But there's a curator in Japan who I rely on when I have a question, and I'll ask him about stuff. He's a collector of like pre-war stuff as well. So there are some people in Japan who are also, but they've also been very supportive. So I have a collaborative relation with like the people in Japan who do this kind of research.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously, yeah, it's like a special. I mean, but that's kind of with any medium out there, really, right? I mean, once you get to like trying to get into the historical aspect of it, I mean, most folks, it's not really their thing. You know, it's just like, you know, it's very specialized. So it's like, but that's why it tends to be one of the more unique and rewarding aspects of kind of any what do you call it, craft out there. At least in my opinion.
The biggest reward for me personally was that I'd always wondered about this. Like, I'd always wondered, like, why are manga so similar to other comics? Like, why is this so, if it evolved from two completely separate origin points, like, why did they end up looking so similar? And like, the research has finally allowed me to answer that question for myself. So that was the biggest reward.
You have somebody out there you have somebody out there still screaming and saying, like, they're not similar, they're different, you know. No, I'm kidding, but.
And then we roll into the final question. Traditional, as everyone put it, something we've having on almost every episode. It still stands to tradition today. What is your ultimatum, as it originally is turned, updated to? What is your end game? Where is all this going?
Yeah, what is my end game?
Your personal end game in all of this.
I'm currently writing a longer story, like a longer history of manga, because there really is no. So I'm kind of afraid that someone else is going to do that, is going to take the research that I did in this book and just going to publish whether like a trade publisher, and sort of just use my research to complement the gaps in existing research. So I'm currently working on like a longer, like from the 1890s to today. That's currently my biggest project. So I guess that you could call that my end game. I don't really have anything planned for beyond that, but I do want to do that and sort of make sure that there's like a book out there for people who really want to know how did manga develop, and like sort of see the entire picture, including like the structures of the publishing industry, and like a coherent story that's not like, oh, manga used to be this thing and then was this and then was this. It just like jumps around, but like a coherent story that sort of traces both these like formal and stylistic developments, like the appearance of like these paint stars and like the mainstream drawing style, the publishing structures with these magazine publishers. So that's I guess my end game. And to the question is asking where you can order a copy, it's wherever. Support your local bookstore. You can ask them to order it. There's also if you can't do that, there's a website called bookshop.org, which like funds local bookstores. I mean, you can get it from Amazon, but if you want to support a local bookstore, you can get it from bookshop.org or directly from any bookstore really can order it.
Okay, and we just put that in the comments too, bookshop.org, so you guys can go there as well. Now,
did I say bookstore.org? I'm sorry if I said the wrong thing. Bookshop.
Yeah, bookshop.org, right?
Okay, because like 3 people wrote in the comments, so I was like, oh, did I say the wrong thing? No, yeah, bookshop.org.
Oh no, yeah. So before we wrap up here, I do want to know, you did just mention where you can get the book, but where can we find anything else, as it relates to you, like whether it be, to follow you, to know what's going on, like, go ahead.
I have a Twitter account under my name. I have an Instagram, pre-war_manga, where I post a lot of pictures. So if you want to actually, for the person who was like, this guy's a bozo, I have a lot of pictures where you can see more evidence that I wasn't able to put into the book. what else? I made a YouTube video actually where like if you want to like rehash anything that I've said, if I was rambling too much, you can check out it. That's also under my real name, Eike Exner, if you look that up on YouTube. Yeah, that's about it. And if there's any updates on anything, I'll post that somewhere on social media.
And I'm not even gonna lie, because it was really recent too, I do want to go ahead and congratulate you on that, Eisner.
Thank you.
So great job on that.
Right.
So you have it near you by any chance? I'm just curious.
I do actually. I do have it. It's like it was very rewarding after, because I mean I couldn't find a job in academia because of this. I mean, maybe not only because of this research topic, but at least in part. And like I had one like really terrible peer reviewer who was like, this book should not be published, it's garbage. So it was like really, really nice to like get some recognition that like at least to some people it actually did matter what I like spent like 5 years of my life on. So it was very nice. Thank you. If anyone's watching this who voted for the book, thank you so much.
Again, thank you so much for coming on today, Eike. We really appreciate it. Really quickly, for anybody who's watching, if you guys did enjoy this video, please go ahead, thumb up this video, like it on Twitch, like it on YouTube, like it on Facebook. It really helps out, the stream. It helps out the show, Shining Spotlight Show. If you're watching this on Spotify, make sure you share this around, because I know usually the Spotify episodes come out a little bit later. So you're probably watching this like maybe about a couple days after we actually did the live stream, but we appreciate you all. Make sure you check out all of the links and pick up this book, guys. Especially if you're going to challenge it, pick it up, read it, and then challenge it. That way, you know what you're talking about when you go into it. So, with that being said, subscribe, and thank you guys for watching. One last thing. If you guys, have been following our developments on the Killbox project, which is our hip hop battle manga series, make sure you go ahead and you check out the YouTube channel, as that is where all of the developments will take place in terms of the updates for that. And that is, again, Killbox, the battle rap series that we're working on. So with that being said, we will see you guys in 2 weeks. Our next guest is Midnight Cross. She, has, I think, about 20,000 followers on YouTube. So a lot of you guys may know her. She does a lot of videos on manga tip videos, that sort of thing. So make sure you're there 2 weeks from now, same time, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Bring your questions, you name it, and we will see you guys later. One last applause for Eike Exner for coming on today. And
thank you so much for having me. That was fun. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will see you guys next time.
Get y'all later.